Section 32 of Pantropheon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Pantropheon by Alexis SOYER. Variety of Repasts. The fertile country inhabited by the Jewish people furnished them with a great variety of excellent provisions. Those of which they made the greatest consumption, and which we find generally mentioned in the Scriptures, are bread, flour, barley, beans, lentils, wine, raisins, figs, honey, butter, oil, sheep, oxen, fatted calves, etc. The fat of animals offered in sacrifice was reserved for the Lord. But, with this exception, the Hebrews could freely make use of it. They esteemed it much, and when they wished to speak of a rich banquet, they called it a banquet of fat animals. He that loveth wine and oil, says Solomon, shall not be rich. The extreme simplicity of the greater part of the biblical repasts ought not to induce us to suppose that the Jews were entire strangers to the inspirations of good cheer. Solomon's provisions for one day were 30 measures of fine flour, and 60 measures of meal, 10 fat oxen, and 20 oxen out of the pastures, and 100 sheep, besides harts, roebucks, and fallow deer, and fatted fowl. That primitive nation also knew different kinds of banquets, which, conformably with their naive manners, were associated with the celebration of a religious solemnity, a sad or a joyful event, a family festivity or mourning, a victory or a public calamity. The Greeks and Romans, skilful masters in the art of good living, were early on the alert to assure the collection of all things necessary for the support of life. "Take care," said Aurelian to Flavius, "take care, above all things, that the markets of Rome be well supplied. Nothing more gay or more peaceful than the people, when they are well fed." This remark is much more profound than it at first appears. At Athens, special officers visited the markets, and only permitted each citizen to purchase and keep in his own house the quantity of provisions necessary for 1 year. The ediles of Rome performed nearly similar functions. The prefect of the town was invested with the power of making regulations for the markets, and the prefect of provisions had the inspection of the sale of bread, meat, wine, fish, and all other kinds of aliment required either for the table of the rich or poor plebeian. During a long time, in Greece and Italy, the only charm of repasts was, that they furnished an opportunity for the exercise of those duties of kind hospitality, which Apollodorus has described in the following ingenious style: "As soon as a friend," says he, "steps on the threshold of his host, the porter receives him with a smiling face. The dog of the house comes immediately to caress him, amiably wagging his tail; then some one runs and presents him a seat without being told." This last trait is charming. But afterwards, they thought much more of honouring the god of good cheer than Jupiter hops, and joyous Comus became everywhere the fashionable divinity. One of the ancients describes him in the following manner: "He is seen at the door of an apartment communicating with the banqueting hall. His smiling face is fresh, plump, and ruddy. His head is crowned with roses, and he sleeps standing. His left hand rests on a thyrsus, but sleep makes him lose his hold. He staggers, and the torch will soon fall from his grasp. The Greeks were fervent in their worship of this god, an epoch when Rome still prided herself on her transcendent sobriety. Cannon gave a banquet to all the Athenians after the battle of Cnidos, about 4 centuries before the Christian era, and his celebrated contemporary, the handsome Alcibiades, conqueror in the Olympic games, magnificently regaled the numerous spectators who had just applauded his triumph. The pagan temples themselves often rung with the sound of the music, the chants, and the dances which always accompanied the religious banquets. These feasts in honor of the immortals must have been rather unedifying to the truly faithful, for gaiety generally degenerated into extreme licentiousness. The conquest of Asia was fatal to the Romans. Their savage rudeness yielded to the effeminate manners of the vanquished, and henceforth the Epicureans of Italy studied but one thing, gastronomic delectation, had but one worship, that of the goddess Ventura, protectress of food and sovereign of the table. Luxury made appalling progress. Nearly a century B.C., the Romans did not blush to give 50 denarii £1 16s. For a young fatted peacock, 3 denarii at least, more than 2s. for a thrush, and a century later 4,000 sesterces £36 were given for a couple of fine young pigeons. Worse followed. Seneca describes in a few words the luxury of the table among the voluptuous Romans. "Behold," says he, "Nomentus and Apicius, these happy conquerors of all that is delectable on earth or in the sea. Behold them at table, stretched on their couches, and contemplating innumerable viands. Harmonious songs flatter their ears, a variety of pleasing objects occupy their eyes, and the most exquisite savours captivate their insatiable palates." The genius of gluttony multiplied the banquets by prescribing luxurious gastronomic assemblages, sometimes in honour of the gods, and often for the gratification of simple mortals themselves. Each year, at the Ides of November, a repast was offered to Jupiter in the Capitol, Cania Capitolina. The statue of God was present at the banquet, reclining on a magnificent couch, with Juno and Minerva seated on either side. These divinities were splendidly served, and, as they touched nothing, in the middle of the night the 7 epulary priests joyously eat the supper of the 3 immortals. The cereal banquet, Cena Cerealis, was equally splendid, and Ceres maintained the same frugality. A sterile reminiscence of the equality which reigned among men in the Golden Age placed the slaves at table by the side of their masters during the celebration of the Saturnalia (Canae Saturnalis). This usage was common to the Greeks and Romans. The 9th day of the August calendus, and the 13th day of the November calendus, a gastronomic solemnity, a monstrous gala, brought together the Roman pontiffs to celebrate the day of their inauguration, Cana Pontificalis. This banquet was worthy of the proverbial delicacy of those sacred stomachs. The augurs treated themselves magnificently in their turn, Cana Auguralis, when they entered on their functions. Pagan priests of Rome vied one with another in a noble emulation of exquisite refinement and ruinous viands; but it is said that the ministers of Mars, who had the reputation of being arch Epicureans, Caecilius, always won the palm in this struggle of magnificence and voluptuousness. The day the Emperor took the title of Augustus, he gave a supper carne imperatoria to the senators and magistrates. The tribute of a year were sometimes hardly sufficient to indemnify the grand master of these imperial orgies. The triumphal banquets (carne triumphalis) were less elegant, no doubt, but they cost the victor who invited the people immense sums. The guests crowded into the vast enclosure of the temple of Jupiter Capitolinus, or the temple of Hercules. They sat down to table to celebrate the anniversary of a birthday (cœna natalia), the happy wedding day (cœna nuptialis), the arrival of a friend (cœna adventalia), the sad day of his departure (cœna vatica). The melancholy ceremony of interment was followed by a supper (cœna funeribus), at which the guests were the relations and friends of the deceased. They drank to his manes, and by degrees the wine not only stifled their laments but called forth joyous smiles. The Romans have bequeathed to certain modern nations more than the remembrance of their funeral repasts. In the palmy days of Athens, the Greeks evinced more of the Epicurean than the glutton, a fact which may be inferred by the description of the supper of Dinas. The most magnificent of their repasts was, perhaps, that which Alexander the Greek had served to 10,000 guests, who received, each one, a present of a golden patera. In Greece, as in Rome, the greater part of the events of life occasioned the joyous meeting of relations and friends. At the birth of a child, a banquet was given in his honour. He was named on the 10th day, and the ceremony terminated with a banquet, in which they offered the guests cooked cherso cheese, cabbage broiled in oil, pigeons, thrushes, fish, and brimming cups of excellent wine. The teething repast took place when the child had attained his 7th month, and the weaning supper when he began to eat. These family feasts, more or less sumptuous according to the fortune and rank of the individuals who gave them, were generally signalized by a custom which ridiculous and egotistical vanity could alone authorize and maintain. On the banquet day care was taken to throw the feathers of the poultry before the door of the house, in order to excite the fruitless greed of the poor wretches, who, as they passed, prayed heartily that the infernal divinities might take the proud Amphitryon, his guests, and even the meanest of his servants. In France, about 1350, the septier, about 12 English bushels of wheat was worth 7 pennies, rye 3 pennies, beans 5 pennies, peas 6 pennies, a hogshead of wine 4s. 7 pennies, a load of hay 1s. 10 pennies, an ox 6s. 10 pennies, a horse 11s. 6 pennies, a calf 1s. 2 pennies, a sheep 4 pennies, a fat pig 2s., a gosling 1 penny, a hen 3/4 of a penny, 100 eggs 1.5 pennies. 1 pound of butter, 3.5 pennies. 1 pound of honey, 10.5 pennies. 1 pound of wax, 1 shilling 10 pennies. Prices of a few articles in France during the 15th century. 1 pound of bread, a quarter penny. 1 pint of wine, 1/4 penny. A pint of mustard, 3/4 penny. A bushel of salt, 2.5 pennies. 1 pound of pepper, 2 pennies. 1 pound of cinnamon, 1 shilling 2 pennies. 1 pound of bacon, 3/4 penny. A pair of pigeons, 1.25 pennies. A pair of partridges, 2.5 pennies. A cartload of wood, un voie, 8 pennies. A sack of charcoal, 1 penny. 1 pound of candles, 1/2 penny. In England, under the reign of Edward III, a royal proclamation fixed the price of the following articles: a swan, 4 pennies. A porcel, 8 pennies. An ewe, 6 pennies. A capon, 6 pennies. A hen, 4 pennies. A pullet, 2.5 pennies. A pousselin, 2 pennies. A coonie, 4 pennies. A teal, 2 pennies. A river mallard, 5 pennies. A snipe, 1 penny. A woodcock, 3 pennies. A partridge, 5 pennies. A plover, 3 pennies. A pheasant, 1 shilling 4 pennies. 12 eggs, 1 penny. 12 small birds, 1 penny. The funeral repast of Sir John Redstone, Mayor of London, who died in 1531, occasioned the following expenses: sheep breed, 7 shillings 5 pennies. 7 pounds of sugar for the same, 4 shillings 1 penny. 2 ounces of saffron, 2 shillings. 2 ounces of cloves and mace, 1 shilling 8 pennies. 7 ounces of pepper, 10.5 pennies. 60 eggs, 7.5 pennies. 7 dishes of butter at 4.5 pennies the gallon, 3 shillings 3.25 pennies. Manchett breed, 1 shilling. 400 of pears, 2 shillings 4 pennies. 1 pound of biscuits, 8 pennies. To the pike monger, 16 pikes, at 1 shilling 4 pennies apiece. 1 pound 1 shilling and 4 pennies. 8 rounds of sturgeon, 1 pound 2 shillings. To the poulter, 6 rounds of brawn, 11 shillings 8 pennies. 10 swans, at 6 shillings apiece, 3 pounds. 2 dozen of quails, 10 shillings. 3 dozen of rabbits, 6 shillings 6 pennies. 22 capons, 12 shillings 10 pennies. 9 dozen of pygons at 10 pennies per dozen, 7 shillings 6 pennies. 4 geese, 2 shillings 8 pennies. 300 eggs, 3 shillings 9 pennies. To the boucher, a sirloin of beef, 2 shillings 4 pennies. Half a veal calf, 2 shillings 8 pennies. 4 marybones, 8 pennies. To the milk wife, 2 gallons and 6 dishes of butter, 4 shillings 2 pennies. 8 gallons of cream, 4 shillings. 12 gallons of curdle, 1 shilling 6 pennies. To the brewer, 3 barrels of ale, 11 shillings. A kilderkin of beer, 1 shilling. 4 double beer to the table, 4 pennies. Yeast, 4 pennies. To the vintner, 32 gallons of red and claret wine, at 10 pennies per gallon. £1 6s. 8d. 3 gallons of macaray, 4 pennies. A rundlet of muscadine, 6s. 1 pound of bread, 1/4 of a penny. The grocer, 6 ounces of pepper, 9 pennies. 4 ounces of cloves and mace, 2s. 4 pennies. 2 ounces of saffron, 1s. 10 pennies. 18 pounds of prunes, 3s. 8 pounds of corins, 1s. 8d. 6 pounds of dates, 2s. 11 pounds of biscuits, 10 pennies. 12 pounds of sugar, 7s. 5 ounces of cinnamon, 1s. 3d. 4 ounces of ginger, 6 pennies. The baker, 4 bushels of chet, at 1s. 10d. the bushel, 7s. 4 pennies. For hot bread, 4s. For fine flour, 10 pennies. For bastard flour, 1s. 10d. The chandelier, a peck and a half of salt, 6 pennies. For candles, 4 pennies. For vinegar, 4 pennies. For vergis, 6 pennies. For packthread and mustard, 2 pennies. For capers, 2 pennies. For lop of pots, 8 pennies. For hire of pots, 4 pennies. The cook, for his labour and company for 18 messes of meat, 15s. For yerbies, 8 pennies. A quarter of a hundred of fagots, 1s. 2 pennies. For coals, 1s. 6 pennies. Paid the turners of brioches and sculdons for them, 1s. 4 pennies. The following is a correct copy of a monster bill of fare from a paper found in the Tower of London. 300 quarters of wheat, 300 tuns of ale, 104 tuns of wine, 1 pipe of spiced wine, 10 fat oxen, 6 wild bulls, 300 pigs, 1004 wethers, 300 hogs, 3000 calves, 300 capons, 100 peacocks, 200 cranes, 200 kids, 2000 chickens, 4000 pigeons, 4000 rabbits, 4000 ducks, 204 bitterns, 400 hernseys, 200 peasants, 500 partridges, 5000 woodcocks, 400 plovers, 100 curlews, 100 quails, 1000 eggets, 200 rees, 4000 bucks, does, and roebucks, 155 hot venison pasties, 4000 cold venison pasties, 1000 dishes of jellies, 2000 hot custards, 4000 cold custards, 400 tarts, 300 pikes, 300 breams, 8 seals, and 4 porpoises. At the feast the Earl of Warwick was steward, the Earl of Bedford treasurer, the Lord of Hastings controller, with many noble officers, servitors, 1000, cooks, 62, kitcheners and scullions, 515. In France, 14th and 15th centuries, the repasts were commonly divided into 5 parts, called courses or dishes. The first course was composed of cherries, tender fruits, citrons, and salads. Milk porridge, puddings and potages followed. It was the second course. The third consisted of roast, with various sauces. The second roast, or fourth course, presented the guests with venison and game. The fifth course took the name of fruit course. At this they served tarts made with all sorts of herbs, flowers, grains, vegetables, and fruit. End of section 32. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC.
Section 33 of Pantropheon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Pantropheon by Alexis SOYER. The Dining Room. The Coecilium, dining room, properly so called, was the place in the upper part of the house where they eat. It was reached by a staircase, and thither persons repaired during the summer, particularly in the country. The Roman villas terminated by a platform, on which the Romans often collected at mealtime. The air was not so hot, and the panorama of the neighboring country seats was presented without obstruction to the gaze of the guests. The dining room was commonly decorated with fasces of arms and trophies, which served as a memento of the warlike virtues of the ancestors of the master of the house. Enchanting frescoes stood out marvellously from the obscure shading of the wall, round which were twined fresh garlands of flowers, and a mosaic floor, masterpiece of art and patience, harmonized with the fascinating landscape of the ceiling, the site of which varied with every course. The Emperor Nero, who carried this taste for the beautiful rather too far, devised a sort of vault, in the most elegant style, and entirely composed of movable leaves of ivory, which exhaled sweet perfumes, and whence flowers fell on the guests. In another of his dining rooms, admiration was excited by a magnificent dome, the rotary movement of which imitated, day and night, the course of the celestial bodies. These prodigies of ancient mechanism adorned the palace that the prodigal Caesar called the Gilded House. The colossal statue of that prince rose in the middle of the hall. It was 120 feet high. Studious people, or those who wished to appear so, covered some part of the dining room with books, for it was a custom introduced into Rome to have recitations or readings during the repast. Atticus had always a reader, and Juvenal promises the friend he invites to supper that he shall hear some fragments from Virgil and Homer. The Greeks yielded willingly to this intellectual pastime at the commencement of the banquet, whilst incense and other perfumes filled the room with a light vapour. Opposite the entrance door stood a buffet, sometimes of iron, but more generally among the Greeks of sculptured wood, bronze, or silver, on which were represented the heads of oxen or satyrs. This piece of furniture was placed under the protection of Mercury, and a curtain commonly veiled the front of it. It served for the display of precious plate, vases of silver, silver gilt, and gold, enriched with magnificent precious stones. The buffet of the Romans, a sort of sideboard of rare workmanship, was appropriated to the same use. Sometimes a single foot supported a white marble table, surrounded with a border of vert antique, and plates and dishes were arranged on two elegant shelves placed above. Again, the artist frequently conceived the idea of giving a whimsical form to the buffet, which enhanced its price. It was a ship laden with the vases necessary for the banquet. 4 enormous amphorae occupied the deck. On the two sides of the mast. Towards the prow was a candelabrum, and at the stern was displayed a large-bellied cantharus, or vase, with mobile handles. The main topmast was replaced by a large urn, and two cups of Bacchus were gracefully balanced at either extremity of the yard, along which were suspended craters, or vases used in drinking wine. The buffet of the Greeks and Romans survived the ruins of those two celebrated nations. We find it again in the Middle Ages, and even more in modern times. Then also, rich people loved to display their plate on a very apparent piece of furniture, which, being dressed, took the name of dresser. Monstrelet, describing the magnificence of the Duke of Burgundy during his sojourn in Paris, relates, that in the room of his mansion in which he eat was a square dresser, dressoir, with shelves, which dresser was covered and loaded with very rich gold and silver plate. Sovereigns who affected great magnificence had buffets of metal. There were three, one for silver, one for silver gilt, and one for gold. At the banquet which the King of France, Charles V., gave to the Emperor Charles IV., his uncle, each of the three buffets was of the same metal as the plate it supported. After the birth of a child, ladies, when they received visits, had a dresser placed in their room. Those of countesses and great ladies had 3 shelves. Those of the wives of the younger sons of baronets had 2. Women well connected but not titled could have no shelf. Those who enjoyed the honours of the court placed by the side of the buffet a little table, covered with a white cloth, destined for the hippocras and spiced wine they offered their visitors, and which they drank in hanaps, or a kind of chalice of earthenware, gold or silver. Those of crystal were much esteemed. Charles the Bald gave to the Abbey of St. Denis a hanap, said to have belonged to Solomon. It was of pure gold, fine emeralds, fine garnets, and the work so marvellous that in all the kingdom of the world never was there anything so perfect. The great lords also indulged in metal dressers, to which the 16th century gave the name of buffets. Under Hendrie II. of France, the court called them credence, from an Italian word bearing the same meaning, and which they had retained. The Hebrews probably knew nothing of chimneys. When King Jehoiakim burned the book which Jeremiah had written, he sat in the winter house in the 9th month, and there was a fire on the hearth burning before him. When among the Greeks or Romans they wanted to warm the dining room, they also had recourse to braziers or bronze furnaces of the dimension of a middling-sized table, resting on lion's claws. Foliage in copper, bronze, and silver was artistically encrusted round the edge. The bottom was a very thick iron grating. Above and beneath, brickwork prevented the coal from touching the upper part, or escaping through the interstices. They also made use of 2 kinds of stoves to warm the dining room. The one was concealed underground in the massive wall, and little pipes extended from its orifice to the apartment. The other, portative and light, disappeared whenever it was judged expedient. Among the pagans the dining room was lighted by torches made of a resinous wood, or tallow candles. The rich headlamps, candelabra, or magnificent lustres suspended from the ceiling. They even knew the luxury of wax candles. In the Middle Ages sovereigns and the great lords had, in the middle of their dining rooms, fountains playing, which poured forth wine, hippocras, and other liquors. Some gave rose water and divers odoriferous liquids to perfume the banqueting hall. Rubruquis found in Tartary a Parisian goldsmith, Guillaume Boucher, who had settled under the sway of the Khan, and had made him one of those fountains. The municipal bodies adopted them. At the entrance of Charles VII into Paris, one of this kind was seen in the Rue St. Denis. One of the tubes spouted milk, another vermilion-colored wine, another white wine, and another pure water, and persons stood all around with silver cups to give drink to the passer-by. In the 17th century playing fountains was still used at repasts. End of section 33. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC.
Section 34 of Pantropheon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Pantropheon by Alexis SOYER. The table seats. It is pretended, says Athenaeus, that in the Homeric times each guest had a table to himself, on which he was served with a saddleback of beef, or a whole sheep or goat. It was the custom among the heroes, all men of high lineage, and tolerably aristocratic in their tastes. The burglars of those warlike times and the villains of the epoch ate their dinner, without form or ceremony, on a heap of grass, which also served them as a seat or couch. Wooden tables, at first very clumsy ones, no doubt, only came into use when the development of human industry had enabled men to understand that they might be preferable to a truss of hay. A passage in Homer would seem to show that they were very much like ours. Perhaps the circular form was generally preferred. Luxury soon called for the most precious metals, and the Greeks had, at a very early period, tables of bronze, and even of fine silver. The Isle of Rhena produced magnificent ones, and an expensive fashion caused those luxurious pieces of furniture to be prized when they presented delicate incrustations of silver, bronze, or ivory, and rested on lions' claws or leopards' feet. Cneius Manlius introduced these rarities into Rome after the conquest of Asia. He also was the originator of tables veneered with plates of gold, which ere long adorned the dining rooms of princes and senators, and the excessive price of which only surpassed by that of tables made of precious woods from distant countries. The maple, the whitten, and a species of African lemon tree occupied the first rank, and the prodigious skill of the workmen gave them a value superior to gold and silver. The most beautiful of these tables were spotted or veined to imitate the tiger or panther's skin, but they acquired an exorbitant claim upon the admiration of connoisseurs when they bore the marvellous design of a peacock's tail. This fantastic play of nature commanded a boundless price. An artist of unrivalled talent, Carvilius Pollio, was the first, according to Pliny, who enriched these magnificent woods with bulwark of ivory and shell in the acme of perfection. Under the reign of Nero, the Romans dyed this shell, and thought to increase its primitive value by giving it the tints and accidental shades of the cedar, the maple, and the lemon tree. These splendid pieces of furniture were at first square, then round, then in the form of a half circle or half moon, and this horseshoe-shaped table they called a sigma, from the name of that Greek letter, which resembled our C. The guests whom any person wished to honor most were placed at the extremities of this hemicircle, overlaid with magnificent covers, which replaced the skins of beasts formerly used for their adornment, and, in addition, they were spread with tissues of fine linen and rich stuffs elaborately worked. The tables were changed at each course. The Greeks cleaned them with sponge. The Latins used a sort of thick plushed linen cloth. The opulent citizens possessed a great number of tables. Some were ivory, others of maple wood, cedar of Mount Atlas, or lemon. Cicero had one of this latter kind of wood, which cost him 20,000 sesterces, about £1,480. They rested on 1, 2, or 3 feet, and were called monopedes, bipedes, and tripedes. The Romans often changed tables only twice during the repast. Fish and flesh appeared on the first, and the fruit was served on the second. The same custom was common to the Greeks and the Oriental nations. The Hebrews had also two tables in their solemn feasts and sacrificial banquets. On one was served the flesh of the victim, and on the other they placed the cup of benediction, which passed round from one to another, and was called the cup of praise. The luxury of Rome seemed to revive after she had become extinct. St. Remi, Bishop of Rheims, left to his heirs a silver table, embellished with figures. Charlemagne had 3 made of the same metal. The first represented the ancient capital of the world, the second Constantinople, the third every known region of the earth. Aymar, Viscount of Limoges, found on his estate a treasure, which consisted of a table, round which were seated an emperor, his wife, and several children, all as large as life, and of massive gold. Richard Coeur de Lion pretended that the treasure belonged to him as Lord of Limousin, and went to lay siege to the castle of Chalons, to which Aymar had retired, where the king received a wound, of which he died the 6th of April, 1199. Silver tables still existed in the 17th century. Madame de Sévigné (1689), speaking of persons who, following the example of Louis XIV, sent their plate to the mint, says, "Madame de Charles has sent her table, 2 guerdons, and her beautiful toilet of silver gilt." At some distance from the sigma, on a slightly raised platform, were 3 kinds of elegant credences for the cups, wines, and vases. The major domo himself generally attended to this part of the service. A very curious old book, cited by Strutt, the Book of Keawe, contains the following instructions as to the manner of laying the cloth for the King of England: "Serve your sovereign with wafers and pocrus. Also lock your compost be fair and clean, and your ale 5 days old before men drink it. And be courteous of answer to each person. And when ye lay the cloth, wipe the border clean with the cloth. Then lay a cloth, take your fellow that one end, and hold you the other end. Then draw the cloth straight, the bot on the outer edge, lay the other part and hang it even. Then take the third cloth, and lay it bout on the inner edge, and lay estat with the upper part half a foot broad. Then cover thy cupboard and thine auri with the towel of de paper. Then take thy towel about thy neck, and lay that on side of the towel upon thy left arm, and thereon lay your sovereign's napkin, and on thine arm 7 loaves of bread, with thee or 4 trencher loaves, with the end of the towel in the left hand as the manner is. Then take thy salt cellar in thy left hand, and take the end of the towel in your right hand, to bear in spoons and knives. Then set your salt on the right side, where your sovereigns shall sit, and on the left side the salt set your trenchers. Then lay your knives, and set your bread one loaf by another, your spoons and your napkins, fae folder beside your bread. Then over your bread and trenchers, spoons and knives, and at every end of the table set a salt cellar, with 2 trencher loaves. And if ye make your wrapper mannerly, then take a towel of reins of 2 yards and a half, and take the towel by the ends double, and lay it on the table. Then take the ends of the bott, a handful in your hands, and wrap it hard, and lay the end so wrapped between 2 towel. Upon that end so wrapped lays your bread, bottom to bottom, 6 or 7 loaves. Then set your bread mannerly in form, and when your sovereign's table is thus arrayed, cover all other boards with salt, trenchers, and cups, and say then, Uri be arrayed with basins and ewers, and water, hot and cold, and see ye have napkins, cups, and spoons, and see your pots for wine, ale be made clean, and to the surnap make curtsy with a cloth, under a fair double napery. Then take the towel's end next you, and the other end of the cloth, on the other side of the table, and hold these 3 ends at once, and fold them at once, that a plait pass not a foot broad. Then lay it as it should lay, and after met wash with that it at the right hand of the table, ye must guide it out, and the marshal must convey it, and look on each cloth, the right side be outward, and draw its strength, that must ye reese the upper part of the towel, and lay it without only going, and at every end of the towel ye must convey half a yard, that the sewer may make reverently and let it be. And when your sovereign hath washen, draw the syrup even, then bear the syrup to the midst of the board, and take it up before your sovereign, and bear it into the ewe again. And when your sovereign is set, lock your towel about your neck, then make your sovereign curtsy, then uncover your bread, and set it by the salt, and lay your napkin, knife, and spoon afore him. Then kneel on your knee till your purpain pass 8 loaves, and look ye see at your ends o' the table 4 loaves at a mess, and see that every person have napkin and spoon, and weigh well to the server how many dishes be covered, that so many cups cover ye. Then serve ye forth the table mannerly, that every man may speak your curtsy. The table seats. The Jews originally sat down to their meals, but when they became subject to Persia, they laid on couches at their repasts, like their conquerors, and other oriental nations, from which the Greeks and Romans borrowed their custom. The most distinguished place was at the head of the table, at the extremity of the room, near the wall. Saul sat in this place of honor. Under the reign of Solomon, the Hebrews still used seats. The Egyptians were early acquainted with the effeminate sumptuousness of table couches. They often placed on them the venerated images of Jupiter, Juno, and the king himself. Before they had adopted this refinement of Oriental luxury, the Greeks sat at their repasts on chairs, more or less costly, but all very elegant, similar to those which adorn our drawing rooms, and which have been modelled from theirs. Homer's heroes sat down to table, and Alexander the Great appears to have preserved the custom. That prince giving a repast to 10,000 persons, caused all to be seated in silver arm chairs, covered with purple. However, Hesingander assures us that, among the Macedonians, he who had succeeded in killing a wild boar, reclined at full length whilst the other guests remained seated. Italy always imitated Greece, and like her had table couches, which at first were only used by men. A feeling of propriety interdicted their use by women, but the relaxation of morals, seconded by fashion, soon banished this seeming reserve, and the two sexes could only eat in a reclining posture. A round, low table made of common wood, and resting on three legs, was placed in the dining room of persons in humble life. The rich had it made of lemon or maple wood, and supported by a single ivory foot. The three couches at most were arranged round this table (triclinium), sometimes two, which Plautus names biclinium, and these they covered with purple or other magnificent stuffs. Before they placed themselves, the guests performed their ablutions and threw off their togas, to substitute the dinner robe. They then took off their sandals, and lay down, 3 or 4 on each couch. The rules of good society did not allow that number to be exceeded. The upper part of the body was supported by the left elbow, the lower part was extended. The head was slightly raised, and downy little cushions supported the back. When several persons occupied the same couch, the first placed himself at the head, in such a manner that his feet nearly reached the shoulders of the second guest, whose head was before the middle of the body of the preceding one, from whom he was separated by a cushion, and his feet descended to the back of the third guest, who followed the same order with respect to the fourth. When a couch contained 3 persons, the one in the middle occupied the place of honor. When there were 4, that distinction belonged to the second. The place at the head of the couch was only offered to the most worthy, when not more than 2 persons were on the couch. Among the Persians, the middle place was reserved for the king. Cyrus placed on his left the guest to whom he wished to do the most honor, the next on his right, the third on his left, the fourth on his right, and so on down to the last. In Greece, the most distinguished personage occupied the head of the table. The voluptuous Heliogabalus only made use of couches stuffed with hare's down or partridge's feathers. The Emperor Aelius Verus introduced a more exquisite novelty. He had his filled with lily and rose leaves. The first of these princes, a cruel monarch, or capricious child, according to his strange whims, amused himself, sometimes, by placing on a couch, round the sigma, at one time 8 bald men, at another 8 gouty men, one day 8 grey-headed old men, another day 8 very fat men, who, were so crowded together that it was almost impossible for them to raise their hands to the mouth, and the brainless dolt shook with laughter at their efforts and their contortions. One of his favourite diversions consisted in filling a leathern table couch with air, instead of wool, and while the guests were engaged in drinking, a tap, concealed under the carpet, was opened; unknown to them, the couch sank, and the drinkers rolled pell-mell under the sigma, to the great delight of the beardless emperor, who enjoyed greatly his espalier. The Celts seated themselves at their repasts on hay before very low tables; the Belgians reclined on a kind of couch; the Gauls on the skins of dogs or wolves. These different authorities are easily reconciled, for they relate to different cantons of Gaul. The use of couches was not unknown in the Middle Ages. We find the proof of it in the fabliaux of the 13th century. We have also the description of a magnificent repast given by a bishop to two great officers of Charlemagne, at which the prelate was seated, or lying, on feather cushions. But this fashion was unsuccessful, and people preferred wooden seats and stools covered with carpet. When they gave a great feast, they seated the guests on benches (bancs), whence came the word banquet. Henry III. of France introduced armchairs for himself, and folding stools for his suite. Sometimes people eat on the floor. St. Arnold, Bishop of Soissons, took his repasts in that manner on the day of the dedication of a church, after having had carpets spread on the ground. In the winter, the banqueting place was spread with straw or hay, and in summer with grass and leaves. Pelicans and tavern keepers decorated their rooms in like manner. The gallantry of the Middle Ages has led to the adoption of a rather singular custom, which consisted in placing the guests two and two, man and woman, and serving for each couple one common dish, which they called eating in the same porringer. Neither had they more than one cup. In families the same goblet served for all. St. Berlanda was disinherited by her father, who was exasperated because, under pretext that he was leprous, she had washed his goblet before making use of it for herself. A passage in Martial would seem to imply that the guests, among the Romans, laid the cloth themselves; that is to say, they spread on the sigma the stuff, more or less precious, with which it was then to be adorned. A somewhat whimsical custom was established in the Middle Ages of chivalry. When it was intended to affront any one, a herald, or king at arms, was sent to cut the cloth before him, and turn his bread upside down. That was called cutting away the cloth, and was practised in reference to cowards and faithless vassals. It is thought that Bertrand Gillian was the originator of this custom. Mention is made of tablecloths in the life of St. Eloi. They were in use on common tables, but the costly ones were not covered. These cloths were plushed and shaggy, as we find by the description of Nicolas, the author of a poem on Louis the Debonair. They were of vast dimensions. In the inventory of certain effects in the monastery of Fontenelle, in the 9th century, we read of 4 tablecloths, each of which measured 12 yards and a half by 2½ another 12½ by 3¾ and 13 3 yards and 3/4 wide. In the 12th and 13th centuries tablecloths were called, in France, doubliers, doubtless because they were folded in two. This practice was eventually given up. and instead of a double cloth, the first was covered by a smaller one, and removed at the last course. Henry III required this dessert cloth to be artistically plaited, so as to present pleasing designs. Napkins were much used in Greece and Italy. In the time of Augustus, and many years after, each guest brought his own, as we bring our pocket handkerchiefs. Catullus complains of a certain Asinius who had stolen his. Martial brings a similar accusation against a parasite named Hermogenes. Napkins were sometimes made of asbestos, and they were thrown into a brazier to clean them; but these rarities were seldom possessed by any but princes, for asbestos was as expensive as jewels. The constitution of St. Agonistus for the monastery of Fontenelle mentions plush napkins to wipe the hands, but they were only used before and after the repast. The town of Rheims was renowned in the Middle Ages for the manufacture of table linen. When Charles VII made his entrance there, they presented him with napkins, very rich and curious by reason of the beautiful flowered work. End of section 34. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC.
Section number 35 of Pantropheon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Pantropheon by Alexis SOYER. The Servants. All the opulent families had a great number of servants, or slaves, whose low extraction, the chances of war, or the parental will, subjected to the caprices of the rich as a mere thing possessed, a right, a property. They were known, like the slaves of the Jews in former times, by their ears, which were pierced with an awl, an ineffaceable stigma which always reminded the free man of his former humiliation. The slave was also often marked with a hot iron on the back, the hands, the cheeks, or the forehead, and the characters thus imprinted served the master as an evidence against his fugitive servant in whatsoever place he might find him. It is perhaps similar marks that the prophet Zechariah makes allusion, when he says, "What are these wounds in thy hands?" Plautus, whose comic vein respects neither the power of the gods nor the sanctity of misfortune, calls these unfortunate creatures lettered slaves, servus litteros. A house of any note could not do without a crowd of servants, to whom the steward, dispenser, apportioned the labour, the food, and the chastisements. In a lodge near the vestibule was the porter, Osterius, whose watchful eye observed every one who went in or out by day or night. They made sure of his vigilance by chaining him to his place. The hall, atrium, was guarded by an intelligent and confidential servant, whose functions raised him above the other slaves. The atriensis, such was his designation, had the care of the arms, trophies, precious furniture, and books, which adorned this apartment. He had also to take extreme care of the paintings and wax figures that preserved from the motives of vanity or by a sentiment of respect, and it was he who carried the images of venerated ancestors before the funeral procession of the head of the family, when, in his turn,
death had numbered him with the progenitors. The obstinator bought in the markets the meat, fruit, and delicacies necessary for the repasts. The vocatores carried the invitations, received the guests, and placed them at a table according to their rank. These functions required a particular kind of urbanity with long experience on the part of the individual who fulfilled them. The arrangement, the keeping in order and adornment of the table couches belonged exclusively to the cubiculari valets. These servants are mentioned in Suetonius and other ancient authors. The Caesars had a great number of cubiculari who obeyed one particular chief. The Dapiferii brought the dishes into the dining room, and other nomenclators immediately informed the guests of the names and qualities of the things which they were going to be served. The structor arranged the dishes symmetrically. The Caesar carver cut up the meats to the sound of musical instruments, of which he followed the measure. Finally, young slaves, processores, served the guests attentively, and poured out their drink. Those chosen for this employment were fine, beardless, adolescent youths, with a fresh complexion, whose long silky hair fell in curls over the shoulders. A wide riband which went twice round the waist confined their fine, white tunic, a light, graceful vestment, which descended in front to the knees, and behind hardly covered the hamstring. While the guests, softly reclining on their table couches, were enjoying the agreeable surprise reserved for them by an amiable Antipholon, slaves, Sandagirli, attended to their sandals, and fastened them on the moment of departure. Others, Fabularii, armed with fans of peacock feathers, drove away the flies and cooled the banqueting hall. The banquet terminated. Servants with torches and lanterns, adversatores, conducted their masters home, and pointed out to them the stones that might be lying in their path, and with repeated libations might have prevented their visual organs from discovering. We must not omit, in this nomenclature of the principal servants of a good house, the taster, progustor, who tasted or tried the viands before the guests touched them, nor the chief steward, triclincharts, and director of the repast, who had to occupy himself with the infinity of details in the kitchen, the cellar, the pantry, the buffet, and the dining room. In living synthesis of these multiplied services, he performed them all himself. The least negligence, the slightest absence of mind on his part, would have ruined the reputation, utterly marred the sumptuous hospitality of his master. Never did the general of any army tremble under the weight of a responsibility so redoubtable. Procellitores, or cupbearer, an officer whose duty was to fill and present the cup to the king and princes. This charge was known in Egypt, and the ancients transformed Ganymede into a cupbearer to the gods. Charlemagne had master cupbearers. These officers signed royal charters, and kept rank amongst the great officers of state. The head one took the title of Usenson to the king, of master, premier, or great Usenson. In the 15th century the Usensons exercised their functions only on the coronations, marriages, and entries of kings and queens. Louis XVIII re-established the office of Premier Usenson. It was abolished in 1830. There was, moreover, a class of miserable, obscure, despised slaves, whose useful labours rendered them necessary, and who were treated much the same as beasts of burden. This order of subaltern servants were composed of the ledicari. They carried the elegant palanquin in which the haughty matron or the noble senator were conveyed to the banqueting hall. The stokers, focari, who cut the wood, lighted, and attended to the fires. The sweepers, scopari, whose indefatigable activity kept the apartments and furniture clean. The washers, penticuli, with a sponge and cloth they cleaned the precious tables which adorned the connocealum or dining room. Sometimes also they had to lay the covers. This rapid sketch will enable the reader to form a sufficiently correct idea of the comfort and luxury which prevailed among the Romans, and of which the Greeks set them the example. It is hardly necessary to remark that the cupbearers, stewards, carvers, and other household officers, whose names belong to modern Europe, perform functions analogous to those which similar servants performed formerly in Italy, but these last were debased by the stigma of slavery, and degraded by long habit, whilst the others were citizens. End of section 35. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC.
Section 36 of Pantropheon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lynda Neilson, Vancouver, BC. Pantropheon by Alexis SOYER. Section 36. The Jews and the Egyptians washed the feet of the persons whom they received into their houses, and offered them larger portions as a mark of greater honour. These homely and hospitable usages have disappeared with the simplicity of the primitive ages. The Greeks required their guests to arrive neither too soon nor too late. It was a rule of politeness from which nothing could exempt them, and which we ourselves observe at this day. In the Homeric ages each one received his share of meat and wine, and the man who at the epoch piqued himself on his knowledge of the science of life never failed to offer his neighbour a part of his dinner. So Ulysses gives Demodocus one half of the chine of beef, with which he is served. It is true that the king of Ithaca was regarded as a perfect model of complaisance and delicacy. Another custom, adopted it is said only in the modern taverns and dining rooms, was that of warming the remains of a preceding banquet for other guests. It must have constituted very poor fare, for the Greeks were remarkable for formidable appetite, and their repasts were prolonged indefinitely. The banquet of Menelaus, noticed by Athenaeus, is a proof of it. They eat at first without speaking, and after prodigies of mastication they begin to discourse. Then, having washed their hands, face, and beard, a fresh attack was commenced, more formidable than the first, and when the ardour and energy of the assailants seemed to be exhausted, they hardly took time to breathe ere they fell on the viands with renewed avidity. Nothing resisted them. The dishes were cleared. Only a few bones remained to certify their achievement. A saddening, unsatisfactory trophy for future guests. Archistrates, whose gastronomic axioms we cannot respect too much, was averse to large dinner parties. 3 or 4 persons, 5 at most, chosen with care, assembled with taste, appeared to him sufficient for those solemnities in which silence was to be maintained so long, under pain, and Montmar, of no longer knowing what one eats. The Lacedæmonians admitted as many as 15 guests, but they elected a king of the banquet, and that ephemeral autocrat decided without appeal all questions which might have compromised the tranquillity of the banquet. Greater numbers met together in Athens. Plato gave a supper to 28 of his friends. Hundreds of citizens often met together at the public repasts. But then a magistrate was deputed to see that modesty, moderation, and temperance were observed. The Romans understood that it is at table that one lives, so they gave those whom they invited the name of conviva cum verve, living conjointly, a charming type of that easy, gentle cordiality which arises, is fortified and displayed between those who partake of the same dishes, drain in friendship cups of the same wine, and separate with the hope of soon seeing a return of the same pleasures. People were very polite in Rome, as in Greece, when they met in the dining room. Never did they fail to make a low bow. This act of Roman courtesy recalls a very pretty expression of Fontenelle's, which we cannot refrain from citing. This grand nephew of the great Corneille passed, on his way to the table, before Madame Helvétius, whom he had not perceived. Fontenelle was then 90 years of age. "See," said she, "what esteem I must have for your gallantry. You pass before me without looking at me." "Be not surprised, madame," replied the old gallant. "If I had looked at you, I should never have passed." In the year of Rome 570 (182 B.C.), the tribune of the people, C. Orchius, was the prime mover of the first sumptuary law, which enacted that the number of guests were not to exceed that of the Muses, nor be less than that of the Graces. Subsequently, 7 were thought to be sufficient, and some insisted that when there were more, the banquet ought rather be called a rout. In the year of Rome 548, the consul C. Fannius carried a law (Le Fanier) which prohibited the assembling of more than 3 persons of the same family on ordinary days, or more than 5 at the nones, or on festival days. This rigorous measure was pressingly solicited by the rational portion of every order of citizens, who could not witness without a shudder the whole of Italy plunge into the most brutifying excesses, after obscene orgies which we dare not describe. But who could dissipate that fearful bewilderment with which nations seem to be seized when they are about to fall? Rome blushed for her ancient virtues, and veiled them with dissolution and crimes. She had exhausted all the prodigies that the genius of debauchery could invent. She created monsters. Ruinous banquets soon revived, and the number of guests that had no other rule than the unbridled desire of ostentation and expense. Let us not forget those miserable parasites who managed to get to the corner of a table in Greece and Italy, and to whom meagre portions were conceded as a reward for cringing servility, such as the vilest slave would have been ashamed to exhibit. There were 3 kinds of parasites. Some, under the name of buffoons, amused the company with their grotesque attitudes and ridiculous sayings. Others allowed their ears to be boxed, and suffered 1,000 different torments, providing a piece of meat or a bone were afterwards thrown to them. These patient sufferers diverted the Greeks and Romans very much. The adulatory parasites were most skilful of these hungry pariahs. They were well treated and almost respected. They were persons who possessed a kind of merit which was always equally appreciated, and to which we still render justice. They flattered whosoever gave them a supper. An energetic familiar expression in French often replaces the word parasite, transmitted to us by the Greeks and Romans. That expression, which conveys the same idea, is pique assiette, an image necessarily associated with disdain and insult. The Count de Gerval had invited to his table several persons of high distinction, among whom was remarked one of those intruders who find means to get themselves received, notwithstanding the profound contempt they inspire. The dessert was just served, and a magnificent pear attracted the attention of the parasite, who endeavoured to bear it off on the point of his knife, but, in doing so, he broke a valuable plate. "The deuce take it, sir," said the master of the house, "pique l'assiette as long as you like, but don't break it." The guests always washed their hands, and frequently their feet, before they placed themselves on the triclinium. They received that custom from the Orientals, and we find numerous examples of it in the Old and New Testaments. Perfumes were then poured on their heads, as among the Jews, and wreaths of flowers were offered them. It was at this solemn moment that the guests turned their attention to the election of the king of the banquet, whose grave functions consisted in regulating the number of cups that each one was expected to empty during the repast. Among the Anglo-Saxons, he who wished to drink asked the nearest person to pledge him. The latter replied affirmatively, and immediately armed himself with his knife or his sword to protect the other while he emptied his cup. The death of Edward the Martyr, it is said, gave rise to this custom. Elfrida, his mother-in-law, caused him to be basely assassinated from behind whilst he was drinking. The following, says Strutt, according to ancient historians, is the manner in which Rowena, daughter or niece of Hengist, drank to the health of Vortigern, king of the Britons. She entered the banqueting hall where the prince was with his guests, and making a low curtsy, she said, "To your health, my lord and king." Then, having put the cup to her lips, she presented it on her knees to Vortigern, who took it and emptied it, after having replied, "I drink to your health." We find in the works of Pasquier an affecting anecdote of the unfortunate Queen of Scotland, Mary Stuart. On the eve of her death, says he, towards the end of the supper, she drank to all her attendants, commanding them to pledge her, the which obeying, and mingling their tears with their wine, they drank to their mistress. Divers spectacles, of which we shall have occasion to speak hereafter, occupied the leisure of the guests during the interval necessary to remove the remains of one course and serve the next. These representations and amusements, of which they never tired in the Middle Ages, received from our ancestors in France the name of entremets, a designation much more true and just than the modern acceptation imposed on the word, anything served between the roast and the dessert. The entremets were interludes, pantomimes, concerts, and even melodramas performed between each course, so that a piece which in our days attracts crowds to one or another of the theatres, would have been then a little entremet, or a cold side dish, hors d'oeuvre. In 1287, at the marriage of Robert, son of St. Louis, with Machault, Countess of Artois, very singular spectacles were given between each course of the banquet. A horseman crossed the hall by making his horse walk on a thick cord, extended above the heads of the guests. At the four corners of the table were musicians seated on oxen, and monkeys mounted on goats seemed to play the harp. A droll custom prevailed at the court of Frank kings. St. Germer having come to solicit some favour from the king of the Franks, Clovis, that haughty Sicamber, received the bishop with kindness, and had an excellent dinner served for him. The holy bishop took leave of the king after the banquet, and the king, who sometimes piqued himself upon his politeness, pulled out a hare, according to the custom of the time, and offered it to his guest. Each of the courtiers hastened, in turn, to imitate the benevolent monarch, and the virtuous prelate returned to his diocese enchanted with the reception he had met with at the court. Among other amusements prepared for Queen Elizabeth during her sojourn at the celebrated castle of Kenilworth, there was, says Laneham, an Italian juggler who performed feats of strength and leaps, and cut such capers with so much suppleness and ease, that I began to ask myself whether it were a man or a sprite. Indeed, I know not what to say of that comical fellow," adds the artless chronicler. "I suppose his back must resemble that of a lamprey. It had no bone." In England, during the Middle Ages, the courts of princes and the castles of the great were crowded with visitors, who were always received with sumptuous hospitality. The pomp displayed by the lords was truly extraordinary, and it is difficult to understand how their fortunes could suffice for it. They had their privy councillors, treasurers, secretaries, chaplains, heralds, pursuivants at arms, pages, guards, trumpeters, in a word, all the officers, all the servants, with which royalty itself is surrounded. And besides this numerous domestic establishment, there were troops of minstrels, clowns, jugglers, strolling players, rope dancers, etc., lodged there at the great banqueting times. Each of the apartments open to the guests presented spectacles in harmony with the gross taste of the epoch. It was a marvellous confusion, a prodigious chaos, in which the ear was struck at once with the sound of dishes, of cups clashing one against another, of harmonious music, with the bustle of the dance, the notes of the song, pasquinades, somersaults, and everywhere the most boisterous laughter. The face of decency alone was slightly veiled. Sometimes the term entremets was also applied to decorations, which were paraded through the banqueting hall, and which represented cities, castles, and gardens, with fountains, whence flowed all kinds of liquors. At the dinner which Charles V. of France gave to the Emperor Charles IV. there was a grand spectacle, or entremet. A vessel appeared with its masts, sails, and riggings. It advanced into the middle of the hall by means of a machine concealed from the view of all. A moment after there appeared the city of Jerusalem, its towers covered with sarkines. The vessel approached it, and the city was taken by the Christian knights who manned the vessel. Among the Egyptians a funeral idea was made the means of rousing the erewhile buoyant spirits of the guests at the end of a repast. A servant entered carrying a skeleton, or the representation of a mummy, which he took slowly round the dining room. He then approached the guests, and said, "Eat, drink, amuse yourselves to day. To morrow you die." Greece and Rome in particular adopted this lugubrious emblem of the rapid flight of time and pleasure. This sepulchral image hurried them on in the enjoyment of the present. It never revealed to paganism a hope full of immortality. End of section 36. Recording by Lynda Marie Neilson, Vancouver, BC.
Section 37 of Pantropheon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pantropheon by Alexis SOYER. Chapter 35. A Roman Supper. 2 lustres had passed since the world obeyed Domitius Nero, son of Agrippina. The Romans, a herd of vile slaves, docile adulators of the infamous Caesar, had already celebrated 9 anniversaries of his happy accession to the empire, and the Flamen of Jupiter solemnly thanked the gods at each of these epochs for all the benefits that the well-beloved monarch had unceasingly lavished on the earth. Few princes, it is true, ever equalled Nero. He and his mother had poisoned Junius Silanus, the proconsul of Asia. Subsequently the young emperor made away with Agrippina, and the Senate applauded that horrible crime, which was only the prelude to outrageous enterprises which astonish the historian who narrates them. The Flamen was indeed bound to offer up solemn thanksgivings to Jupiter for having hitherto restrained the crowned monster from the commission of evil which afterwards marked his flagitious career. It was the 64th year of the Christian era. The emperor had passed some time at Naples, whence it was thought he would go into Greece. But suddenly changing his project, he returned to the capital of the world, to prepare, it was said, a spectacle of unheard-of splendor, and such as Nero alone could conceive. One of his ancient freedmen, Gaius Domitius Seba, resolved to celebrate the return to Rome and the 10th anniversary of the reign of his master, who was now become his patron and friend. That man possessed immense riches, a formidable credit at court, and an insolence which had struck so much terror into the souls of the proudest families of the empire, that they had long since humbled themselves before him. So that it was no sooner whispered among the Roman aristocracy that the magnificent Seba intended to give a banquet, than one and all became anxious to be numbered with the guests of Caesar's favourite. However, days passed. The time for the nocturnal festival approached, and the inviter had not made his appearance. Among the Hebrews nothing was more simple and unsophisticated than an invitation to dinner, but with the Romans etiquette required that the amphitryon should send one of his servants to each person who was to participate in his pompous hospitality. This servant, who was generally a freedman, went from house to house, and indicated with exquisite politeness the day and precise hour of the banquet. Seba's inviter was at last announced to the 2 consuls of the year, Licanius Bassus and Licinius Crassus, who accepted with tender gratitude the distinguished honour which the enfranchised slave deigned to confer upon them. Afterward the same favour was received with the same gratitude by the Agrippas, the Ancuses, the Cossuses, the Drususes, and all those who were the most noble, powerful, and proud in Rome. The next day, about 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the repast was to begin at 6 o'clock. An unusual movement reigned in the Palatine Baths, and those of Daphnis near the Sacred Way. The Mediastini kept up a steady fire under the coppers, the Capsari folded with care the clothes of the bathers, the Unguentari sold their oils and unguents, and the Fricatores, armed with the strigil, a sort of wooden, iron, or horn spoon, rubbed and scraped the skin before the Tractatores came gently to manipulate the joints and skilfully shampoo the body, which gained by this operation more elasticity and suppleness. The upper classes of the Romans never sat down to table until they had undergone all these preliminaries of minute cleanliness. The future guests returned home after the bath to employ the skill of the barbers, tonsores, who were in waiting to give more grace to the hair and remove, with the aid of tweezers and pumice, the first silvery indications of the lapse of years, which, though incessantly effaced, still reappeared. A more serious occupation succeeded. Epicureans should never neglect their teeth, particularly at the approach of a banquet. Nor did the ingenious gastronomy of the 1st century of our era neglect to invent tooth powder, which cleaned the enamel without injuring it, and fortified the gums, those fortresses of mastication. Some persons made use of substances which no one would adopt in the present day, because our delicacy revolts against them. But preparations less offensive were employed, and men of good taste, as well as fashionable ladies, extolled ox gall, goat's milk, the ash of stag's horns, of pig's hoofs, and of egg-shells. Thus were the teeth equipped, as the comic Plautus has it, or rather thus they were prepared to undergo the labour required of them. Those who had had the misfortune to lose some of those powerful gastrophagic auxiliaries substituted false ones of ivory, which art found means to render absolutely similar to their neighbours. The eye was deceived. What more could be required? But the clepsydræ and the celebrated clock of the Field of Mars announced that it is time to put on the white, light robe a little longer than the pallium of the Greeks, and to which the Latins have given the names of vestis cinatoria, vestis triclinaria, vestis convivialis. This last part of their toilet finished, the guests set out for the magnificent abode of their host, preceded by a few slaves and followed by their shadows, those hungry hangers-on of whom mention has already been made, and who strove to obtain on the road a smile or a word by dint of cringing obsequiousness. Arrived at the atrium, the crowd of Roman nobles are conducted into the interior of the house by the parasites of Seba. The proud freedman disturbed himself for nobody, but like the opulent Greeks whom he aped, he left to these ignoble families the care of replacing him in the honours of his palace. They enter an immense hall, decorated with unheard-of luxury, lighted by lustres, and round which are several ranks of seats, not unlike the folding stools and armchairs we meet with in the present day in the most elegant boudoirs. The guests seat themselves, and anon Egyptian slaves approach with perfumed snow water, which flows from golden vases of the most graceful forms, and cools the hands of senators and Roman knights, whilst other servants disencumber them of their patrician shoes, the end of which represents a crescent. The feet then received a similar ablution, and fresh slaves, skilful orthopedists, accomplish in a twinkling the delicate toilet of these extremities, and imprison them again in elegant and commodious sandals, fastened by ribands which cross on the top. Here and there a few persons are remarked who still wear their togas, having doubtless forgotten to substitute the banqueting dress. So soon as the major domo perceives them, he makes a sign to some youths clothed in white tunics, who hasten to present to each of these guests a synthesis, or short woolen vestment of different colours, which envelops the whole body, but leaves the shoulders and breast uncovered if the wearer desire it. These indispensable preliminaries being terminated, the seats disappeared, and the guests stood waiting for the freedman Seba, who speedily entered, accompanied by the 2 consuls, for whom places of honour had been reserved on couches beside their pompous amphitryon. The latter deigned to address a few words of welcome to his noble company, and each one stretched himself on his couch of gold and purple. The 4th couch was given up to the parasites and shadows. Meanwhile slaves were burning precious perfumes in golden vases, acari, and young children were pouring on the hair of the guests odoriferous essences, which filled the banqueting hall with balmy fragrance. Rome had borrowed this custom from the East. The golden panelling of the hall shone with dazzling brightness, as it reflected a torrent of light from the crystal candelabra, and the melodious sounds of the hydraulic organ announced the commencement of the banquet. At this signal, servants, richly dressed, place within the circle formed by the couches lemon-wood tables of inestimable price, which they immediately cover with a rich tissue of gold and silk. That done, sylph-like hands spread them over with a profusion of the rarest flowers and rose-leaves. Musicians, symphoniaci, then occupy a kind of orchestra or platform, raised at one of the extremities of the hall, among whom the flute and harp players are to be particularly remarked. The former constitute among the Romans a special body dubbed with the name of college, and they have the exclusive right to attend banquets and enliven the pomp of ceremonies. These musicians execute a slow, dulcet melody, while the slaves are placing on the tables the statues of some of the principal gods, together with that of the divine Nero, whom a pusillanimous flattery ranks already with the immortals. At this moment they also arrange here and there the salt cellars, while the more meditative of the guests invoke Jupiter before they give themselves up to the pleasures of the feast. Hardly is this short prayer finished when joyous cupbearers distribute charming little crystal cups, which Ethiopian slaves fill to the brim with a generous honeyed wine, drawn in the first instance from those large pitchers which the Greeks have named amphorae. Some drops of the exhilarating liquid are offered to the Lares, household gods, by sprinkling it in their honour on the floor and the table. This pious libation precedes the entrance of the first course, Antikoena, composed of the lightest and least succulent kinds of viands, by means of which a generous host stimulates the appetites of his guests, as a preparative for brilliant exploits. Lettuces, olives, pomegranates, Damascus plums, tastefully arranged on silver dishes, serve to encircle dormice, prepared with honey and poppy juice, forcemeat balls of crab, lobster, or crayfish, prepared with pepper, cumin, and benzoin root. A little further, champignons and egg sausages, prepared with garum, are placed by the side of pheasant sausages, a delicious mixture of the fat of that bird, chopped very small, and mixed with pepper, gravy, and sweet sun-made wine, to which a small quantity of hydrargarum is added. Tempting as these delicate viands may be, the practised Epicureans seem to have a decided preference for peacock's eggs, which they open with spoons. These eggs, a masterpiece of the culinary artist who presides over Siva's stoves, are composed of a fine perfumed paste, and contain each one a fat roasted ortolan, surrounded with yolk of egg and seasoned with pepper. We will not go through the list of all the dishes which compose the Antikoena. The nomenclature was offered according to custom to the guests of the rich freedman, but the reader would doubtless think it a little tiresome. We must, however, inform him that the true gastronomists, and there were many at that banquet, did no more than give note of preparation to their appetite by plying it with pickled radishes, some few grasshoppers of a particular species fried with garum, grey peas and olives fresh from their brine. The first course was removed to the sound of music. Now came chased silver cups much larger than those of crystal, no doubt because thirst is excited by drinking. Amphorae of a secular wine were ranged by the major domo on the mosaic flooring of the hall at some distance from the triclinium, and they proceeded by invitation of the consuls to the choice of the symposiarch, or master of the banquet, upon whom devolved the duty of regulating how often any person was to drink, and of preventing the guests, in the best manner he could, from yielding too easily to Bacchic provocations, which commonly led to unseemly gaiety and the loss of reason. This sort magiric magistry was obtained by lot, or the unanimous call for a personage worthy of such a distinction. That memorable evening every voice named the senator Drusillus, one of the most determined drinkers of the Roman aristocracy. Drusillus smiled, snapped his fingers, and, by the order of his master thus intimated, a slave, who was standing behind him, filled a golden crater with wine and presented it to the symposiarch. Thereupon the latter, slightly raising his head from the downy cushions on which it rested, and supporting it from the left elbow, makes a graceful bow to the amphitryon, the consuls, and the rest of the assembly. Then, with a stentorian voice, "Slaves," he cried, "bring wreaths of flowers. Fugitive images of the spring and of pleasure, they shall bind our brow. At the same time let garlands adorn our craters, in which the cherished liquor of the son of Semele sparkles, and let us bestow no thought during the fleet joys of the banquet on the uncertain and fatal hour when Atropos shall pronounce our doom." This speech, slightly impregnated with the Epicurean philosophy so much in fashion during the reign of Nero, had at least the merit of a praiseworthy conciseness. Nor did it fail to attract applause from the auditors, whose brows and cups were speedily adorned with wreaths of roses, which young boys, clothed in white tunics, arranged with marvellous art. The slight rustling of the flowers was soon drowned by the shrill noise of the trumpets which announced the second course. A flattering buzz welcomed this profusion of viands, which encumbered the tables and well nigh crushed them with their weight. There were the peacock, the duck, whose breast and head are so much coveted, capon's livers, peppered becaficos, grouse, the turtle-dove, the phenicopter, and an infinite number of rare birds, the costly tribute that Europe, Asia, and Africa exchanged against the gold of the prodigal Seba. Other gold and silver dishes contained these inestimable fishes, which Roman luxury brought so much into fashion: the scarus, or parrot fish, sturgeons, turbots, mullets, and those numerous inhabitants of every sea with which the tanks were stocked to supply the kitchen of the freed slave. Moreover, there were wild boars à la Troyenne, ranged in the centre of the table in silver bases of a prodigious value, stuffed pigs, quarters of stag and roebuck, loins of beef, kidneys surrounded with African figs, sow's paps prepared with milk, sow's flank, and some pieces of Gallic bacon, which certain gluttons love to associate with a piece of succulent venison. While the carvers were cutting up the meats with incredible address, to the sound of a light but animated music, Numidian slaves filled the cups from small leathern bottles with old Greek wine. A servant carried bread round the tables in a silver basket, and others ventilated the apartment or offered the guests warm and iced water. In every direction trays circulated, covered with divers kinds of meats, which they took care to humect with peppered garum, that strange condiment which the freed slave procured from Spain at a price equal to its weight in gold. Suddenly the symposiarch commands silence. The musicians obey. The slaves are motionless. "Let us drain our cups," said he, "in honor of Caesar. Let us celebrate the 10th anniversary of his glorious reign, and his happy return to the metropolis of the world. Let us drink, senators and knights, as many craters as there are letters in the cherished name of the emperor." Sense and reason must have succumbed had the patrician assembly toasted Caius Lucius Domitius Nero. It would have been constructive treason not to empty 23 cups, but they limited themselves to 4, which represented the last of these names. Joy unrestrained floated with the fumy wine, furnished from large glass amphorae, on which were these words: "Falernian wine of 100 leaves, made under the consulship of Opimius." The consuls and the Roman nobles almost forgot in the voluptuousness of the splendid repast that the executioner of Britannicus and Burrus, the crowned tiger, was doubtless thinking at that very moment of taking some of the heads then present. A funereal spectacle soon aroused their dormant fears. An officer of the palace presented himself at the door of the banqueting hall. He advanced slowly, followed by 2 slaves, who laid on the table an object covered with a winding sheet. "Pressing occupation," said the imperial messenger, "prevents Caesar from sharing with you the hospitality of Seba. But he thinks of you, and sends you a testimony of his remembrance." "Long live Caesar!" cry the consuls, the freed slave, and some few trembling voices. The officer retires. The veil which shrouds Nero's present from every eye is removed, and all perceive a silver skeleton of terrifying truthfulness, and which, by its admirable mechanism, proclaims artist to be one of those Greeks who have come to Rome to seek fortune and celebrity. This episode engrossed the thoughts of the greater part of the guests, and the old senator Lucius Vafra could not help saying with a sigh to his neighbour Virginius Rufus, one of the consuls of the preceding year, "Fear the Greeks, fear this disastrous present." But the hot wine which was being served, and the healths which succeeded without interruption, drove the sinistrous presage from their minds, and moreover the present of the emperor was nowise contrary to the manners of the epoch, and the thought of death would only have enlivened the repast if it had been presented by any other than Nero. At first healths were drunk in the Greek fashion, that is, beginning by the most distinguished personages, he who drank bowed and said, "I wish you every kind of prosperity," or simply, "I salute you." In pronouncing these words, he who drank the health took only a part of the wine contained in the cup, and sent the remainder to the guest he had just designated. Many craters were then emptied in honour of the mistress of the house, Domini. Neither were the illustrious dead nor absent friends forgotten. The formula was nearly the same for all. "To your healths," said the symposiarch, "to our own, to that also of the friend whom we cherish." Sometimes Drusilla, still fascinated with that dulcet poetry of the Greeks with which, when young, he had stored his mind, would take up the harmonious cadences of Horace, and thus personate, as it were, those divine chanters of Attica who have immortalized themselves by celebrating love, wine, and pleasure. One of his extempore strains, while sipping the sparkling liquor from his cup, was: "This dream of bliss maintain, prolong these happy hours, O all enchanting wines, perfumed with flowers, which Cos and Cyprus rear. Let nothing ever change this soul-felt rich delight, for I would say, when parting for the realms of night, I never knew a tear. This sensual philosophy found numberless echoes in that vainglorious Rome who exhausted her disdain, outrage, and punishments on the so-called new fantastic folly that the Nazarenes were endeavoring to introduce. A few years more, and their doctrine will subjugate the universe. Time passed rapidly, and the meats, divided into equal portions, were served to the guests, who frequently did not touch them, but gave their share to their servants or sent it home. So soon as the major domo perceived that appetite began to flag, he ordered the whole to be cleared, and the dessert, spread on ivory tables, to be substituted for the more substantial comestibles, with which the guests were satiated. Exquisite drinks, artificial wines, delicate and light ailments, still came to titillate the palate and the burthened stomach. Pears, apples, walnuts, dried figs, grapes, 1,000 different kinds of raw, cooked, and preserved fruits. Tarts, cakes, and those incredible delicacies which the Latins designated by the collective generic term Bellaria, wooed the Epicurean, if we may be allowed the expression, with their mild, material, dangerous, and irresistible eloquence. Someone proposed to replace the half-faded flowers by Egyptian wreaths, and every brow was soon bound with garlands of roses and myrtle, interspersed with little birds, which by their fluttering and chirping soon restored the drowsy company to that animation which seemed to wane. Then began the amusements of the evening. A troop of strolling players were admired for their agility and suppleness. Some rolled round a cord like a wheel which turned on its axle. They hung by the neck, by one foot, and varied these perilous exercises in 1,000 different ways. Others slid down a cord lying on the stomach, with their arms and legs extended. Some revolved as they ran along a descending cord. Some, in a word, performed feats of strength and address on the horizontal rope which were truly incomprehensible, and at an elevation from the flooring which would have rendered a fall fatal. To these acrobats succeeded prestidigitators, who appeared to receive a peculiar degree of attention. One placed under cups a certain number of shells, dry peas, or little balls, and he caused them to disappear and reappear at will. The spectators strained their eyes without being able to comprehend anything. Another of these mountebanks wrote or read very distinctly while whirling rapidly round. Some vomited flames from the mouth, or walked head downwards on their hands, and beat with their feet the movements of the most agile dancers. Then a woman appeared, holding in her hand 12 bronze hoops with several little rings of the same metal, which rolled round them. She danced gracefully, throwing and successively catching the 12 hoops without ever allowing any of the rings to fall. After that another juggler rushed, with his breast uncovered, into the midst of a forest of naked swords. Every one thought him to be covered with wounds, but he reappeared with a smile on his countenance, whole and sound. These feats were followed by an interlude in which the parts were amusingly sustained by marionettes. The Greeks knew this childish pastime, and Rome did not disdain it. These little bronze and ivory figures played some comic scenes tolerably well, and obtained the applauses of grave senators, who more than once forgot their senility as they contemplated the grotesque pantomime. The only thing now wanting to render Seba's supper a worthy specimen of nocturnal Roman feasts was to produce before the guests one of those spectacles which outrage morals and humanity. Nero's freedman had been too well tutored to refuse them this diversion. Young Syrians or bewitching Spanish girls went through lascivious dances which raised no blush on the brow of rigid magistrates, who forgot in the abode of the vile slave the respect due to their age and dignity. After the voluptuous scenes of the lewd Celtiberians, blood was required, for they seem to have been formed by nature to take a strange delight in sudden contrasts. 10 couples of gladiators armed with swords and bucklers occupied a space assigned to them, and 10 horrible duels recreated the attentive assembly. For a long time nothing was heard but the clash of arms, but the thirst for conquest animated those ferocious combatants, and they rushed with loud cries on one another. Blood flowed on all sides, the couches were dyed with it, and the white robes of the guests were soon spotted. Some of the combatants fell, and the rattles announced approaching death. Others preserved in their last struggle a funereal silence, or endeavored to fix their teeth in the flesh of their enemy standing erect beside them. The spectators, stupefied with wine and good cheer, contemplated this carnage with cold impassibility. They only roused from their torpor when one of those men, happening to trip against a table, struck his head on the ivory, and his antagonist, prompt as lightning, plunged his sword into the throat of his foe, whence torrents of black reeking blood inundated the polished ivory and flowed in long streams among the fruits, cups, and flowers. The deed was applauded. Servants washed the tables and the floor with perfumed water, and these stirring scenes were soon forgotten. A last cup was drunk to the good genius whose protection they invoked before returning home. Meantime, a stifling atmosphere pervades every part of the hall, and a hollow noise, rumbling in the distance, excites at intervals in the minds of the guests a sort of undefinable apprehension, the ordinary presage of an unknown but imminent catastrophe. The consuls raise themselves on their couches and listen. Their host endeavours to calm their fears, but at this moment a slave, panting for breath, rushes towards Seba and pronounces a few inarticulate words. "Fire!" cries the anguished freeman. "Where is the fire?" inquire all the terrified guests who have heard but this one sinistrous word. "Everywhere," replies the slave. "It has burst forth simultaneously in every part of the city." No one waits to hear more. Consuls, senators, knights, musicians, and servants jostle one another, and, abandoning those who fall, arrive pell-mell at the atrium. The porter, still chained, trembles at his post. The flames already envelop the sumptuous edifice. The entire street is one vast brazier. Rome burns, and will soon be a heap of ruins and ashes. Flight is impossible. The flames intercept every issue. Nero has taken his measures well. We will not attempt to depict the mute but terrible despair of those proud patricians at bay in the midst of an ocean of fire in which they are fated ere long to perish. The wreaths of flowers which bind their brows are already parched by the scorching breath of those roaring flames which engulf and consume everything as they sweep along. A thick smoke begrimes the lustrous robe, whose graceful folds erewhile displayed the exquisite urbanity of Seba's guest, and which now exhibit only a sad emblem of festive joys. The dread of death, and I know not what strange anguish at this all-important moment, blanched those human faces to which the choicest wines of Greece and Italy had just given a hue of purple. These men feel, instinct tells them, that life is theirs no longer, and they have not the courage to die. The opulent freedman calls to his slaves and promises them their liberty if they consent to risk their lives in an attempt to save his. But the vile herd is already dispersed. The porter alone remains, for no one has thought to liberate him, and he, in his impotent fury, replies by insulting clamours to the cowardly supplications of his quondam master. The horrible scene soon changed by the very action of that torrent of fire which was pursuing its devastating course, and the next day, when Aurora appeared, a heap of ruins was all that remained of the odious Seba's magnificent palace. The two consuls and some of the senators were fortunate enough to escape the common danger. Less besotted perhaps by the wine and good cheer, and finding in despair that incredible energy which sometimes operates the same prodigies as courage, they rushed through the flames and gained the country, or those obscure portions of the city which the son of Agrippina had apparently forgotten. Thus it was that Lucius Domitius Nero celebrated the 10th anniversary of his glorious reign. While the fire was rolling on with its resistless flood of flame from temples to palaces and from the circus to the Pantheon, the young poetic Caesar, his brow bound with laurel and holding in his hands a golden lyre, viewed from the top of a tower, where he was surrounded by a troop of histrions and buffoons, the conflagration he had just kindled. And while the imperial Apollo sang some melancholy verses on the fatal destiny of the antique city of Troy, his ignoble courtiers cried with enthusiasm, "May the gods preserve Nero, their august son and the delight of the human race." Such was the last gorgeous feast at which the magiric genius presided in that Rome which Romulus had founded, and which engulfed the treasures and wonders of the world. Destroyed by the imperial incendiary, it arose from its ashes with increased beauty and voluptuousness, and the wild joy of its new banquets caused the thoughtless Queen of Nations quickly to forget the disasters of the past and the sinistrous presages of the future. Biographical Notes. Nero. Lucius Domitius, Nero's father, was Caius Domitius Aenobarbarus. Agrippina was his mother. He took the reins of the empire at the age of 18, A.D. 54, and governed at first with clemency and equity. The Roman people, transported with love for their young prince, indulged the fond hope of long and unalloyed felicity. But they were soon aroused from this delusion to a sense of the dire reality. Nero had forgotten himself in the path of virtue. He rallied by trying his hand at crime, and found at last his true vocation. Others have recounted his detestable infamies. We will merely remind our readers that he poisoned Britannicus, that he caused his mother to be slain, that he killed his wife Octavia by kicking her, and that Seneca, his preceptor, only escaped his cruelty by having his veins opened. In the year 64 he took it into his head to set fire to the city of Rome, and then accused the Christians of that prodigious atrocity. Language cannot describe the unbridled luxury of this ignominious emperor. His gilded house, his ivory ceilings, his marine vases, the nets of gold and scarlet with which he fished, the incalculable profusion of his repasts, everything connected with Nero betrayed a species of pompous monomania, leading to excesses so immeasurable and abominable that in these days they excite doubt or incredulity. The entire world detested the monster. Galba and the Roman army revolted against him, and the pusillanimous Caesar fled barefooted and wrapped in a sordid robe. But alarmed at the idea of the tortures he would have to undergo if he fell alive into the hands of the cohorts and the people, and finding no executioner more infamous than himself, he plunged a sword timidly into his breast, while a freedman, Epaphroditus, guided his trembling hand. This happy event happened in the year 68. Nero had reigned 13 years. This prince sat down to table at midday, and did not quit it till midnight. He had reservoirs stocked with the most rare and exquisite fish, and he gave to his boon companions suppers which vied in delicacy with their astonishing magnificence. Let this, then, plead our excuse for having classed the cruel but Epicurean Caesar among the high culinary notabilities whose names, glory, or excesses we record in this work. Heliogabalus. Heliogabalus, Marcus Aurelius Antoninus Verus, son of Antoninus Caracalla and Semiamira, immortalized himself by his follies, and merited the name of the Sardanapalus of Rome. His grandmother Moesa had a fancy to have him invested with the functions of priest of the sun, and the following year, 218, the army elected him to succeed Macrinus. He was then only 14 years old. It would be impossible to give a complete catalogue of the crimes which stained this precocious monster. His luxury knew no bounds, and his insatiable gluttony led him to send into distant provinces for rare birds unknown in Italy. The golden lamps of his palace were supplied with a precious balm, and scented waters of exquisite delicacy were daily renewed in the vast piscina of this beardless Caesar. His beds were adorned with coverlets of a cloth of gold, and in his kitchens none but skilfully chased silver utensils were employed. It is said that Heliogabalus invented after-dinner lotteries. His guests took the tickets at random, and fate gave to one some vase of inestimable value, to another a simple toothpick. A fortunate adventurer would receive for his allotment 10 elephants, richly caparisoned, and his less lucky neighbour had to content himself with 10 flies, and loud bursts of laughter from the imperial stripling. Thank heaven, this frightful phenomenon of turpitude and folly never attained manhood. The soldiers of his guard massacred him after a reign of something less than 4 years, and threw to the populace the dead body of a young man of 18, who in the course of his brief existence had exhausted the treasures of the empire, and enlarged the sphere of every crime. The gastronomic art is, however, indebted to the odious Heliogabalus for some useful discoveries, and for that reason alone he is here mentioned. Epicurus, born 337 years B.C. in the market town of Gargettus, near Athens, taught in his gardens a system of philosophy which, though indulgent towards the requirements of the senses, possessed the merit of a sovereign disdain for every kind of superstition. Epicurus had a great number of disciples among the ancient pagans, and the sensual philosophy of modern times hails him as a patron. At this very day the dainty livers rally under the joyous banner of the moralist of Gargettus, and his cherished shade inspires the guests and presides over the soothing intoxication of banquets. End of Section 1. Recording by Philip Gould. Section 38 of Pantropheon. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Pantropheon by Alexis SOYER. Section 38. Modern Banquets. We have endeavored to describe in the preceding pages some of those antique entertainments which seem to be the summum bonum of the gigantic power of those shameless dominators of the Roman Empire, whose reigns might be counted as so many banquets, and for whom the entire world was transformed into one vast market. We are reduced to despair when we attempt to depict such sensualism, and we also despair of inspiring belief. When one goes back into those old pagan times, when one shuts out the world as it is to evoke the manners and customs of days gone by and breathe in their atmosphere, the mind experiences a sort of stupefaction. So much is it immersed in the senses, so thick is the moral darkness, so low has man fallen. And, as if it had been decreed that everything should concur to consummate the annihilation of the human species on the one hand, almost the whole family of man was, for the first time since their dispersion, collected into one body under the Roman dominion, which spread its corruption throughout the several members, while on the other hand the hordes of barbarians who pressed round, like ferocious beasts waiting till the arena opened, were about to overrun the earth, in the absence of any civilizing element that could interpose to stay the destruction, by snatching the conquered from the hands of victory, and the conquerors themselves from their own ferocity. It belongs not to us to portray this fearful cataclysm, this sudden transition from the development of all the arts which perpetuate the enjoyments of life to the profound ignorance, the savage rudeness which the northern conquerors imposed on enslaved Europe. The 5th was the last century of Rome. It was then that barbarism became everywhere victorious. The Vandals were masters of Africa, the Lombards of Italy, the Visigoths of Spain, the Franks of Gaul. Literature followed the destiny of the empire and seemed to perish at the same time. It is, however, impossible for nations not to receive as an inheritance from people civilized before themselves a great part of their intellectual cultivation. Happily, modern Europe was swayed by this law. The barbarians reduced Rome by the force of arms. Rome triumphed in the long run over the barbarians by the genius of civilization and her arts. It is known that even after the introduction of vulgar idioms, the learned of the Middle Ages continued the use of Latin, and that in the 15th century that beautiful language, purified from barbarian corruptions, became once more classic, particularly in Italy. At that epoch an obscure inhabitant of Mentz, John Gutenberg, immortalized himself by the discovery of printing, just as the love of antiquity was causing the old literary masterpieces to be sought out, and creating a demand for copies of the manuscripts. Then, as if they had risen from their tombs after 1,000 years of forgetfulness, all the writers of antiquity reappeared to charm, instruct, and renovate the world. It was the era of regeneration, when you, O beloved masters, Pliny, Apicius, Petronius, Athenaeus, and you, ingenious and faithful chroniclers of the gastronomic follies of the People King, were resuscitated in all your glory. Others instructed the universe in philosophy, eloquence, and history. You taught man how the ancients dined, and thanks to your lessons our fathers began to comprehend that since the table is the great scene of life, where bonds of friendship are formed and cemented, banqueting is indispensable to the prosperity of nations. No one will accuse us, we hope, of endeavoring to establish a paradox for which we could hardly find an excuse in our love of the culinary art, as long experience and public facts within the memory of all victoriously confirm our assertion. Let us interrogate the 19th century. Hardly had the lamentable wars which divided the nations of Europe ceased, hardly had the vibration of the last cannon shot died away, when the people of every clime, too long disunited, sealed by fraternal banquets their tardy but frank reconciliation. The destructive genius of war is succeeded by those grand struggles of commerce and industry which, aided by the arts and sciences of civilization, dispense to all the blessing of reproductive wealth. And then dinner is the sine qua non. To that goal all our efforts tend. The Englishman dines in Paris, the Frenchman dines in London, the time-honored national dishes become cosmopolite, like those who dwell on the banks of the Thames or the Seine. On both sides the people are proud to communicate the arcana of those delicate preparations, which have only to cross the frontier to obtain, under a favourable sky, a more ample illustration and a new right of citizenship. Appetite, the roasting jack, in a word, gastronomy, serves perhaps to unite men much more firmly than motives of interest, and more than one thought useful to the human species has often originated in the midst of the creative excitement of a banquet, where, to say the least, we meet with that hearty goodwill and friendly aid which might be wanting elsewhere. Shall we mention that prodigious enterprise with which a noble prince, the enlightened protector of industry and the arts, and so worthy of our love and respect, has deigned to couple a name dear to public gratitude? The royal plan was nothing less than this: to erect an immense, costly, and sumptuous palace, in which each nation should deposit the material proofs of its intelligence. Neither Rome nor Greece ever conceived such a thought. Louis XIV., with all his magnificence and the magic pomp of his reign, imagined nothing equal to it. This great and complex idea struck many persons, no doubt, with surprise. But England, we must do her the justice which facts prove to be her due, is always ready to undertake impossibilities, and generally performs them. However, it was necessary to bring together a certain number of influential scientific, patriotic, and wealthy men, and obtain their cooperation to realize the modern arch of crystal, into which the industry of the world would be summoned to send its most marvellous productions. Banquets were proposed, and banquets took place, in honour of a prince who was about to connect all parts of the globe in the bands of commercial fraternity. The Lord Mayor of the city of London, that celebrated factory of the world's trade, invited all the mayors of the three kingdoms to come and place themselves by the side of the august spouse of their sovereign at a feast worthy of such guests by its delicate profusion and splendid magnificence. There His Royal Highness Prince Albert received the enthusiastic assurance of the realization of a colossal project, a philanthropic thought, the union of nations, by rousing the noble pride of their nationality. In their turn, the mayors of Great Britain and Ireland were desirous of offering to the Lord Mayor of the city of London a banquet, at which His Royal Highness would be present, and this feast, a grandiose and sympathetic demonstration on the part of the votaries of the memorable London Exhibition, took place the 25th October, 1850, in the Gothic Guildhall of York, where remembrance of the past was blended with hopes for the future. It was resolved to entrust us with the direction of the gastronomic department, and, let us add, the artistic arrangement of that banquet, which, by reason of its unprecedented richness and truly magic aspect, no pen can describe, owing partly to the magnificence of the maces, swords, banners, etc., of each county being for the first time displayed under the same roof. The engraving which we present to our readers will perhaps convey an idea of a portion of the splendour of the entertainment. The guests at the royal table consisted of the following distinguished personages: the Lord Mayor of York being in the chair, there were seated on his right His Royal Highness Prince Albert, His Grace the Archbishop of York, Earl Fitzwilliam, Lord John Russell, Earl Minto, Lord Overstone, Lord Beaumont, and the Right Honourable Sir Charles Wood. On his lordship's left were the Lord Mayor of London, the Marquis of Clanricarde, the Earl of Carlisle, the Earl of Abercorn, Lord Feversham, the Earl Granville, the High Sheriff of Yorkshire, the Right Honourable Sir G. Grey, Baronet, and Sir J. V. Johnstone, Baronet. As this table formed a prominent feature in the entertainment, the following distinct bill of fare was provided. Bill of fare for the royal table. First course: Rissolettes à la Pompadour, Trois Potagers, Potager à la Victoria, Potager à la Prince of Wales, Potager tortue transparente, Trois Poissons, Turbot à la Mazarine, Rosés à la Italienne blanche, John Dory à la Marinière, Trois Relevés, L'extravagance culinaire à la Alderman, Chapons à la Neilson, Quartier d'Agneau de Maison à la Sévigné, Venison, Quatre Flancs, Timbale des Riz à la Royale, Hambon à la York, Vol au vent à la Talleyrand, Canetons, Canaries, Macédoine des Légumes. 6 entrées: Sauté de faisans à fumée de gibier, Blancs de Volaille à la York Minster, Turbans de Quenelles de Lapereau aux Truffes, Colettes de Mouton à la Réformée, Riz de Veau à la Palestine, Fillets de Caneton à la Seville. Second course: Trois Rôtis, Paon à la Ancienne Rome garné des Ortolans, Bécassé aux Feuillets de Céleri, Guillenos des Ardents, Dix Entrements, Crème de la Grande-Bretagne à la Victoria, Galatine des Oisons à la Volière, Gelée de Fraises Françaises à la Fontainebleau, Miroton des Homards, Tartelettes Pralinaises aux Cerises de Montmorency, Crème de la Grande-Bretagne à la Albert, Salade de Grasse à la Soyer, Chartreuse de fruits aux pêches, Gâteau créments à la Duke of York, Yocailles à outrées gratinées à l'Ostende, Légumes à la Française, petits pois verts, Légumes à la Française, grosses asperges à l'américaine, Trois relevés, ou des salingiers à la allemande en surprise, Jambon croquant à abricots, Panier des fruits glacés à la Lady Mayoress, Dessert floréal à la Watteau, Raisins de Fontainebleau, Fraises des Bois Français, Pêches de Montréal, Ananas, Raisins muscats, Melons, Bananas, Compote de Chaumontel. General bill of fare for 248 guests. First course, Trenton deux potagers, Quatre potagers à la Victoria, Quatre potagers à la Prince of Wales, Huit potagers à la Tortue transparente, Six potagers à la moderne, 32 poissons, Huit turbots à la mazarine, Huit truites salmonés à la marinière, Huit filets de merlans à la crème, Huit crème cod à outrées, 32 relevés, Six chapons à la Neilson, Six saddleback de mouton gallois, Quatre à l'oeil de boeuf au Rayfort, Six haunches de venison, Six quartiers d'agneau de maison à la Sévigné, Quatre didonneaux in diadame, 22 flancs, Huit jambons à la York, Huit poulards à la Russe, Huit timbales de riz à la Royale, Huit pâtés chauds à la Westphalienne, Quatre heat entrées, Huit sautés de façons à fumer de gibier à truffes, Huit de colettes de mouton à la Vicomtesse, Huit de blancs de volaille à la Yorkminster, Huit de riz de veau à la Palestine, Huit de rissolettes de volaille à la Pompadour, Huit de salmi de gibier à la Chasseur. Second course, Quarante rôtis, Huit de perdreaux aux feuilles de céleri, Huit de façons bordées en cresson, Six de canetons au jus d'orange, Six grasses à la escossaise, Six de levreaux au jus de grossier, Six de basses et bassinines au jus. Saint entremets, Dix chartreuses de pêches, Dix gelées de fraises françaises à la Fontainebleau, Dix salades de grasses à la Soyer, Dix galatines espiquées à la Volière, Dix crèmes transparentes au Kirchenwasser, Dix crevettes à vin de Champagne, Dix gâteaux créments à la Duke of York, Dix petits macédoines de fruits cristallis, Dix mirotons de homards à olives, Dix tartelettes pralinées aux cerises de Montmorency, 20 relevés, Dix paniers de fruits glacés à la Lady Mayoress, Dix jambons en surprise à l'ananas. Side table vegetables, celery à la crème, chou-fleur au beurre, haricots verts, chou de Bruxelles, celery à la crème, chou-fleurs au beurre, sea kale, choux de Bruxelles. Grand dessert floréal à la Watteau. L'extravagance culinaire à la Alderman, or the 100-guinea dish. The opportunity of producing some gastronomic phenomenon for the royal table on such an occasion as the York banquet was irresistible. Accordingly, the following choice morsels were carefully selected from all the birds mentioned in the general bill of fare, to form a dish of delicacies worthy of His Royal Highness and the noble guests around him. The extravagance of this dish, valued at 100 guineas, is accounted for by supposing that if an epicure were to order a similar one for a small party, he would be obliged to provide the undermentioned articles, viz. 5 turtle heads, part of fins and green fat, at the cost of £34. 24 capons, 2 small noi, from ox side of the middle of the back only used, eyeing the most delicate part of every bird, £8 8s. 10 turkeys the same, £8 12s. 18 fatted pullets the same, £5 17s. 16 fowls the same, £2 8s. 10 grouse, £2 5s. 20 pheasants, noix only, £3. 45 partridges the same, £3 7s. 6 plovers whole, 9s. 100 snipes, noix only, £5. 3 dozen quails whole, £3. 40 woodcocks, noix only, £8. 3 dozen pigeons the same, 14s. 6 dozen larks, stuffed, 15s. Ortolans from Belgium, £5. The garniture, consisting of coxcombs, truffles, mushrooms, crawfish, olives, American asparagus, croustades, paste crust, sweetbreads, quenelles de volaille, strips or slices of fowl, green mangoes and a new sauce, £14 10s. Total, £105 5s. In order to present to the reader the striking contrast of extravagance in ancient and modern cookery, we here give an engraving of the celebrated Roman dish, wild boar à la Troyenne, described in page 185. It appears to have been one of those extraordinary efforts of genius which the artist could only produce under the sanction of a lavish patron. It was a veritable tour de force, and no doubt deserved the commendation it received, not only because it was of colossal size and the good taste displayed, but also on account of the various culinary delicacies of which it was composed. We have no account of the cost of such a dish, but judging from the excessive prices given in ancient times for all recherché articles at the tables of the great, it must have been enormous. We will now resume our description of the York banquet. In front of the principal table, on a raised platform covered with purple cloth, was a collection of maces, swords, etc., estimated by competent judges to be worth £12,000. The most conspicuous ornament was placed immediately behind the great circular table. It was designed by the author, and is represented in the accompanying engraving. It consisted of a large emblematic vase, 20 feet in height, painted and modelled by Mr. Alfred Adams. Around the base are Europe, Asia, Africa, and America, presenting specimens of industry to Britannia. From the centre of the base springs a palm tree surrounded by the arms of the cities of London and York. Medallion portraits of Her Majesty and Prince Albert, encircled by the shields of the principal cities and towns of the United Kingdom, form the body of the vase. 2 figures of Ireland and Scotland, the handles, the Prince of Wales's emblem, the neck, and the royal arms, the apex. Appended were graceful wreaths of flowers, in which the symbols of the houses of York and Lancaster, red and white roses, predominated. And when a brilliant flood of gaslight, aided by powerful reflectors, was thrown upon this splendid decoration, the effect was truly magnificent. Having illustrated this volume with a marine vase belonging to the House of Brunswick and a curiously worked crystal cup, as gems of ancient production, we give here, as modern works of art, an engraving representing 3 superb drinking cups, one for His Royal Highness Prince Albert, and one each for the Lord Mayors of London and York. The first is in ruby glass, a portion of the stem and base internally chequered with silver, and on the sides bearing white sunken medallions of Her Majesty and the Prince Consort, and the royal arms of England. The other 2 cups were of the same size and shape, but instead of being ruby and silver, the colours were emerald and silver, and on the sides were the private arms of each of the Lord Mayors, together with the usual heraldic emblazonments of the cities of London and York respectively. They were presented by the author of this work in the name of the Patent Silvered Glass Company. The banquet was of so interesting a nature that we could not omit giving some particulars of it in this work. At all events, the pomp and splendour of modern times, as far as banqueting is concerned, must prove that, from the Greeks and Romans down to the Middle Ages, we have not been exceeded, except perhaps in waste and extravagance. The national entertainments given within the last 50 years to commemorate striking events are too fresh in our memory to pass them in silence. Many persons can still remember the coronation of the Emperor Napoleon in 1805. On that occasion a grand banquet was given to all the dignitaries of the empire and their ladies, nothing being omitted that was calculated to solemnize with sumptuosity such an event. In 1810 the city of Paris offered to Napoleon and Maria Louisa, Archduchess of Austria, a banquet as extraordinary as it was costly. A semicircular gallery of the Corinthian order was erected on the whole square of the Hôtel de Ville, where above 1,000 guests joined the festival. In 1815 a magnificent entertainment was given to the allied sovereigns by the city of London, where richness of decoration, massive gold and silver plate, and profusion of culinary rarities struck the beholder with wonder. At the coronation banquet of George IV. in 1820 the old customs and privileges were ransacked to give éclat to that solemnity, one of the grandest and perhaps the most sumptuous that ever could be imagined in ancient or modern times. In France, in the year 1824, the coronation of Charles X. was celebrated at Rheims with royal magnificence. The banquet excited the admiration of all present. At that solemnity the Duke of Northumberland was appointed ambassador extraordinary from England, and few, if any, ever equalled the liberality of his grace, or the display he made of his wealth, to represent and honour his sovereign and country at the court of Charles X. The fêtes and banquets given by his grace, and at which the author was present, were of the most costly, if not extravagant description, for we are told that the expenses of that munificent nobleman were not less than £200,000. The grand banquets and receptions of King Louis Philippe during 18 years exhibited too much liberality and splendour to be forgotten, and at the marriage of his eldest son, the unfortunate Duke of Orleans, Versailles presented a scene of banqueting and rejoicing unparalleled since the time of Louis XIV. On Her Majesty's visit to the city of London, a banquet was given in the Guildhall, the grandeur of which was scarcely ever exceeded, showing the loyalty, devotedness, and noble hospitality of the wealthiest commercial citizens in the world. In 1838, at the coronation of Queen Victoria, Buckingham Palace witnessed a most elegant, chaste, and splendid banquet. The ambassadors extraordinary, sent from all the foreign courts, were not more conspicuous for the brilliancy of their costumes than the native nobility who graced the festive board of the youthful Queen of Great Britain. On this occasion a very elaborate and graceful fountain of massive gold of about 3 feet in height and 2 feet in diameter was prominent on the royal table. It spouted 4 different sorts of delicious wine into as many shells, from which it dripped into 4 reservoirs, and was served to the guests by means of a golden ladle. This fountain can be seen with the regalia in the Tower of London. On that joyful day the members of the Reform Club entrusted to our care at Gwyndear House a sumptuous entertainment for 1,500 persons on a scale of liberality deserving of the highest praise. The marriage of Her Majesty with His Royal Highness Prince Albert formed one of those memorable epochs to be preserved in the annals of banqueting. The opening of the Royal Exchange in 1846 was also one of those extraordinary days on record, where the Queen of a great nation gave proof of her sympathy in the prosperity of her merchant princes, by presiding over a splendid entertainment to commemorate the re-establishment of that commercial edifice. On the 3rd of July in the same year, His Highness Ibrahim Pasha, son of Mehmed Ali, Viceroy of Egypt, was entertained by the members of the Reform Club to a magnificent and most sumptuous banquet provided for 200 guests. The author, having full scope to do honour to the invitation, provided the following liberal selection of gastronomic dishes, many of which were innovated for the occasion. Bill of Fare: 6 potagers, 4 à la Victoria, 4 à la Comte de Paris, 4 à la Louis Philippe, 4 à la Colbert aux légumes, printaniers. 6 potages, 4 de turbot, sauce à la mazarine, 4 de buissons de filets de merlans à la égyptienne, 4 de salmons de Séverin à la crème, 4 de truites salmonaises, en matelote marinière, 6 relevés, 4 de champons à la Neilson, 4 de saddleback of Southdown mouton, rôti à la Soyer, baron of beef à la Anglaise, 4 de poulards en diadème, 4 de saddleback d'agneau, rôti à la Sévigne, Entrée pagodatique de riz à la Luxor. 54 entrées. Six des poussons printanières à la ambassadrice. Six des colettes de mouton à la réforme. 4 de riz de veau piques en macédoine des légumes. 4 de petites vol au vin à l'étincelle de marquereau. 4 de timbales de riz aux quilles d'agneau. 4 de jambonneaux braises au vin de Madeira. 4 de volets farcis à la rousse, aux légumes verts. 4 de pâtés chauds de caille à la banquière. 4 de rissolettes à la pompadour. 4 de grenadines de bœuf à la Beyrouth. 6 de colettes d'agneau à la vicomtesse et 4 de turbans épigrammes de levreau aux fumettes. 6 rotes. 4 de turkey poult, piqués et bardés. 4 de canetons au jus de bigarades. 4 de levreau au jus de groseilles. Et 4 de gros champons au cresson. 54 entremets. 6 de gélies macédoines de fruits à Danzig. 4 turbans de meringues demi-glacées. 4 de charlotte prussienne. 6 de croquantes d'amandes aux cerises. 4 de galantines à la volière. 4 de mirotons de homard à l'indienne. 4 de salades de volaille à la soyère. 4 de haricots verts à berry noisette. 6 de tartlets pralinées aux abricots. 4 de pain de pêche aux noyaux. 4 de petits pois à l'anglo-français. Et 4 de gélies cristallises à l'ananas. Relevés de rotes. Crème d'Égypte à la Ibrahim Pacha. Gâteau britannique à la Amarelle. 4 de chambons glacés en surprise. 4 de colettes en surprise à la Réforme. 4 de manivaux de champignons au curacao en surprise. 2 de meringues chinoises, pagoda aux fraises. We hardly need mention the annual entertainment which takes place on the 9th of November, when the city of London makes a king of a citizen. In the course of the year 1844, King Louis Philippe paid a visit to Her Majesty Queen Victoria at Windsor Castle, and during the time a series of banquets were given in honour of the King's visit by Her Majesty. The gold plate, worth it is said £1,000,000, was used on that occasion. We shall not attempt to describe the extraordinary beauty of that service. The value in itself must leave the impression that nothing like it is in existence. In the year 1848, the return of Lord Hardinge, Governor-General of India, from his glorious campaigns in the East, was solemnized by a sumptuous banquet offered to his lordship by members of the Carlton Club. In the year 1850, the annual meeting of the Royal Agricultural Society was held in the fine old city of Exeter, where the Society was welcomed with the most enthusiastic rejoicings, and we had the honour of being selected by the committee to provide a dinner for 1,050 members. As this rustic banquet was admitted to be one of no ordinary kind, we give here the general bill of fare, and a short narrative of the first attempt to roast a whole ox by gas. Grand Agricultural Pavilion Dinner. Baron of Beef à la Magna Carta. Grand Agricultural Trophy. 33 dishes of ribs of beef. 35 dishes of roast lamb. 99 dishes of galatine of veal. 29 dishes of ham. 66 dishes of pressed beef. 2 rounds of beef à la Guéric. 264 dishes of chicken. 33 French raised pies à la Soyer. 198 spring mayonnaise salad. 264 cherry, gooseberry, raspberry, and currant tarts, 33 Exeter puddings, 198 dishes of hot potatoes. Homer tells us that a royal culinary artist placed before Ajax and his voracious companions in arms a whole bullock roasted. Since those heroic ages, many no doubt have shared the same fate. And we know that in this country, on the occasion of a rich heir coming of age, a roasted ox is often given to the tenants as a substantial fare with a well-nursed butt of ale, 21 years old. Many can remember that in the winter of 1812 a bullock was roasted on the frozen Thames, which certainly was something to wonder at. Another monster effort was attempted at Hammersmith some years ago, but the animal, clumsily suspended from the summit of an apparatus formed of 3 beams, was burnt, emitted a rank smell, and did not roast. All those who have had to attend such an operation agree that it is rather an awkward affair, and not performed without great difficulties, on account of the immense fire which requires constant attention to keep up and regulate the necessary heat, and, after all, it is seldom entirely successful. For the present festival, the author, who knew well the power and efficacy of gas, wished to honour the guests with a dish of his own, never yet attempted, and which he has entitled the Baron and Saddleback of Beef à la Magna Carta. He therefore proposed to roast a baron and saddleback of beef weighing 535 pounds, in the open air. The magistrates very willingly put the castle yard at his disposal, and it was anticipated that a large pandemonium fire would have been seen. But, to the surprise of every one, a few bricks without mortar, and a few sheets of iron, forming a temporary covering to a space 6 feet 6 inches in length, and 3 feet 3 inches in width, were the only appearance of an apparatus, with 216 very small jets of gas coming through the pipes half an inch in diameter. It was hardly credited that such a monster joint could be properly done by such means. However, incredulity soon vanished on seeing it frizzling and steaming away, and after 8 hours roasting it was thoroughly dressed at a cost of less than 5 shillings for gas. After having allowed it to cool, it was removed and carried by 8 men through the principal streets of the ancient and loyal city of Exeter, accompanied by a band of music playing the roast beef of Old England, and followed by thousands of the incredulous of the previous day. On its arrival at the pavilion, it was deposited under the grand triumphal arch, designed and erected by the author. It was 17 feet high and 10 feet wide, and composed of all the produce of agriculture in the farm. The following list will give you some idea of its magnitude. It consisted of 1 swan, 2 turkeys, 4 geese, 4 ducks, 8 fowls, 8 pigeons, 4 rabbits, 1 fine barn door cock, 6 ox heads, 4 calves' heads, 2 rams' heads, 2 stags' heads, 2 whole lambs, all natural and in their plumage or skin, ornamented with vegetables, fruit, and flowers, viz., cabbages, turnips, potatoes, carrots, leeks, celery, rhubarb, onion, French beans, peas, asparagus, sea kale stalks, sheaves of wheat, oats, barley, pineapples, citrons, cherries, grapes, melons, peaches, apricots, greengages, apples, gooseberries, strawberries, currants, and the choicest kinds of flowers, all being the production of the county, and surmounted by various implements of agriculture. There was also an elegant jug ornamented with flowers, filled with clotted cream. On the top of the huge piece of beef was placed a black pig's head weighing 80 pounds when killed. It was in the recollection of many persons that 35 years ago a baron of beef weighing only 242 pounds was roasted in Exeter under the superintendence of 12 blacksmiths at their forge fire, for a banquet given at the time peace was proclaimed. The Parisians have not forgotten the great fate of the distribution of eagles by His Majesty the Emperor of the French, on that day when he relinquished the functions of President of the Republic for a more august title. That military solemnity was followed by a splendid banquet at which there were several thousands of guests. It would be superfluous to add that the arrangements for that gigantic repast evinced the intelligent taste and incredible resources of imagination of our continental neighbours. An entire volume would not suffice if we attempted to recount all the pompous feasts which followed in succession during the last century, the age of powder and suppers. But we cannot pass in silence the memorable punch given in 1746 by Sir Edward Russell, Commander-in-Chief of the British forces, which can only be assimilated in point of extravagance to the great banquet of the Earl of Warwick, the description of which was extracted from the Gastronomic Regenerator, and reproduced in this work, page 362. The bowl was the marble basin of a delightful garden, forming the central point of 4 vast avenues bordered with orange and lemon trees. A magnificent collation was served on 4 immense tables which occupied the whole length of the several avenues. The basin had been filled with 4 large barrels of brandy, 8 barrels of filtered water, 25,000 citrons, 80 pints of lemon juice, 1,300 weight of sugar, 5 pounds of nutmeg, 300 biscuits, and a pipe of Malaga wine. An awning over the basin protected it from rain, which might have disturbed the chemical combination of the delicious beverage; and in a charming little rosewood boat, a cabin boy belonging to the fleet rowed about on the surface of the punch, ready to serve the joyous company, which numbered more than 6,000 persons. We cannot terminate this rapid sketch without mentioning that after several years of research in compiling this work, we completed our task on the day following that on which Her Most Gracious Majesty the Queen of England offered the largest royal banquet since her accession to the throne to an assembly of kings, queens, and princes, and the flower of the British aristocracy, consisting of 120 guests, on the occasion of the baptism of His Royal Highness Prince Leopold George Duncan Albert. This regal entertainment took place on the 28th of June, and never perhaps did the august sovereign display so much magnificence and majesty. We shall not publish the details of this imposing banquet, and moreover we should inform our readers of nothing new were we to tell them of the artistical selection, execution, and perfection of the bill of fare, of the richness of the ornaments and service, of the royal and feminine gracefulness of the mother, wife, and queen. May Heaven grant, say we, in the words of the immortal Bossuet, that the children of this illustrious princess, like a crown of olive saplings, may cling round her and grow in virtue, strength, and renown. May the ruler of empires throw a halo round the destiny of the august mother, and show to all that his mighty hand upholds thrones and protects kings. End of Section 38. End of Pantropheon, by Alexis SOYER. Recording by Philip Gould.